Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week we're joined by Simon Büchler and Elena Lutz to share with us a very important study on upzoning in Zurich, Switzerland. The Swiss canton, or state, that includes Zurich also has more than 100 other municipalities, and they've been adhering to a regional master plan in their own ways and at their own paces for 25 years. That gave Simon and Elena the ideal conditions to investigate what happens in areas that upzone compared to similar areas that don't upzone for 5, 10, or 15 years later. Combine that with some premium quality Swiss administrative data, and we're in business. Their findings are as you might expect if you're a regular listener to the show. Upzoned areas built more housing than not yet upzoned areas, and areas that upzoned more built more than those that upzoned less. Parcels in neighborhoods with higher rents and less excess capacity prior to upzoning built more than their lower demand counterparts. And despite all the building, rents didn't increase faster in the upzoned areas. This all sounds pretty straightforward, and in some ways it is, but it's worth emphasizing how few studies we have on the direct effects of larger scale zoning reforms, at least the kind of reforms that increase capacity rather than decrease it. Empirical evidence of this quality and depth is really important and not too common, and so we're excited to share it with all of you. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante, Irene Marie Cruz, and our most recent addition, Tiffany Liu. As always, send your questions and feedback to shanephillips@ucla.edu. And with that, let's get to our conversation with Simon Büchler and Elena Lutz. Simon Büchler is Assistant Professor of Finance at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University, which is not in Miami. We may get to that. And Elena Lutz is a PhD candidate in urban planning and urban economics at ETH Zurich. And they're here to talk about their research on the effects of upzoning on housing production and rents in the canton of Zurich. Their study looks at upzonings over a 25-year period, much longer than cities in most developed countries have been engaged in wide-scale upzoning. So it may serve as a window into what to expect in parts of the world that are just getting their start on zoning reform. Simon and Elena, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
And I have in my notes here, introduce Mike. Hey, Mike, but it's actually Pavo. Hi, Pavo.
Hey, Shane, how's it going? Good to see you, Elena and Simon. Thanks for joining us.
Simon and Elena, we always start by asking our guests to give a tour of a city they know well and want to share with our audience. We'll give you each a few minutes, so how about we start with you, Simon?
Sure, Shane. So I'm going to introduce my city, Bern, which is the capital of Switzerland. It's a charming city with a rich history and well-preserved medieval architecture. Actually, the old town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's meandering the Aare River, which actually CNN shows as the most beautiful river in the world. So it's a great river where you can swim during summer, and on hot summer days you may find half of Bern swimming in this river. On a beautiful day from the University of Bern, you can see the Alps. So it's a very, very nice city. It's known for its unique blend of history, culture, and nature. Of course, it has a bear park, which symbolizes the city connection with its emblem, which is a bear.
Is that where Bern comes from?
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
I don't know my German or Swiss German.
So also, you might know that Einstein lived there for a couple of years from 1903 to 1905, where he actually was very productive and finished his theory on special relativity. So there's a beautiful Einstein museum there too. You can visit his house. So the population of Bern is around 130,000, so it's rather small. Metro area is around 400,000, but it's a culturally very rich city, very beautiful, has a lot to offer. So I invite you all to come visit Bern.
Can I just real quick inject a Bern anecdote? Because I got the opportunity. I was invited by the University of Bern to visit, and I agree with Simon. It's a fantastic place. And the museum is my favorite part of a museum that I've seen in Europe to date almost is this collection of treasure and loot that the Burgundian kings stole for like 300 years. Like Bern used to be a real tough place, and they would loot the neighboring Flems and everybody. And the looted treasure rooms is a pretty cool museum exhibit.
Elena, how about you?
Yes, I will give you a tour through the city of Zurich. This is where I'm currently living, and conveniently, it's also the city in which our study that we are going to talk about today takes place. So I think it's anyways great for listeners to get an overview of the city. So Zurich is the largest city in Switzerland. It has like the urban area around 1.5 million inhabitants. And it is also the economic and cultural center of Switzerland. Many universities, firms are here. And I think if someone came to visit me in Zurich, I would start the day at the train station, which is really right in the center of Zurich. From there, you could walk through Europaallee. This is a newly constructed part of the city, let's say, right next to the train station. And it's also the place where there are lots of headquarters of firms such as Google, but when you walk through it, you get to quite a nice part of the city. So just the downtown area with lots of cute little shops and restaurants, and one could have brunch there and try some of the nice Swiss cheeses and breads that I think all the Swiss miss when we're not in Switzerland. And then I think a next interesting stop would be the Landesmuseum. So that's a museum about Swiss history, which is next to the train station. I think it has a really cool exhibition for anybody visiting Switzerland who wants to understand a bit the history of this country. And then next, also as any good Swiss city, we have a lot of rivers and also a lake. So 2 rivers and 1 lake. And from the museum, you can basically exit and take a little boat that brings you down the river to the lake, which is very cute. You get to see a bit the old part of the city, and you end up in the lake where you also have a very nice view on the Alps. I think that's really a beautiful spot on the city. And I think you can also just get off there and walk around the shore and get some ice cream and walk around and see all the locals hanging out there on a weekend. And then next you could go on Uetliberg. Uetliberg is a mountain basically on the side of Zurich, and you can go up and have a view over the entire canton of Zurich. And I think that's also nice because you see on the one hand Zurich, which is very urban, with skyscrapers and kind of like a very urban place. But then you also see that, once you start leaving Zurich, they're really way more suburban and even peri-urban areas. And you see even more the Alps. And then in the evening, I would go back to an area which is called Hartbrücke. So that's an old industrial area, but has many nice bars today. Yeah.
Pavo, was I the only one when Elena said Swiss Miss who thought of the little rolled chocolate things with the white filling in them? Did you miss that
too? I know. Okay. I caught that.
I think I don't know what that is.
It's the name.
It's
a
very
brand
unhealthy.
Unhealthy, kind of like Twinkies. Yeah. I think in my head, I just had in my mind that every Swiss city is immediately surrounded by the Alps. And I was looking at a map of Zurich and
mostly
kind of trying to get a sense for it. It seems pretty flat, actually, compared to somewhere like Geneva or something like that anyway, right?
Yeah, you're still a bit away. I think that's also why it's such a big city there, because you have actually the space to even develop.
But you can see them like across the lake, right?
Yeah, they're not that far.
You can still see them. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that is important. I did want to mention something from your paper you wrote about Zurich. As a major economic and cultural hub, Zurich hosts multinational corporations such as Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, the headquarters of several international banks and insurers, and reputable research institutions, which I thought was very modest to say of yourself.
At this comment, no, and I was like, oh my god, that made it somehow.
Unlike some of those other research institutions that are extremely disreputable.
Yes.
No, but
all right, so today's conversation is about an article published in September of this year in the Journal of Urban Economics titled Making Housing Affordable: The Local Effects of Relaxing Land Use Regulation. Simon and Elena are the 2 co-authors. The study makes a lot of valuable contributions about the short and long-term effects of upzoning, and they do this by comparing outcomes in upzoned areas to non-upzoned areas throughout the 168 municipalities in the canton of Zurich. All of these cities were required, or at least many, were required to update their zoning for higher densities But they were free to do so in different years and with quite a bit of discretion about where they would and would not upzone. And that creates a bit of randomness or variation that strengthens the case that the upzones were the cause of the outcomes that they measured. Breaking the region up into rectangular zones 100 meters on a side, they found that upzoning was associated with an increase in living space and housing units, but no increase in rents. Larger upzonings were associated with larger increases in living space and housing units, as were upzonings that took place in zones with higher rents, and where the zoning was more of a binding constraint, which we'll talk about later. They also found that these effects generally take at least 5 to 10 years to materialize. Part of what makes this research so valuable, I think, is that, for the most part, affordability advocates have to make a pretty indirect case for upzoning based on the evidence. Lots of research shows that more supply is associated with greater affordability, but evidence showing that upzoning actually leads to more housing supply is actually fairly limited, in part because so few places have done it in recent decades. It's not that we don't have any evidence, but we just don't have a ton. Research linking upzoning directly to changes in rents is, I think, even more rare, partly because upzoning has been rare, but also because it's just methodologically challenging to measure. Simon and Elena have managed to do that here, though, and I really do suspect that this study is going to go down as one of the classics in the zoning reform literature. So, as we get started here, can you say more about the state of research on upzoning, housing supply, and rents and home prices, the linkages between all of these things? Beyond my very brief and incomplete overview, what did or does the literature have to say about all this, and what gaps were you trying to fill with this study?
So, Shane, there's a growing literature on upzoning just because it's becoming a popular measure. Affordability issues are things that are happening all around the globe. So a lot of cities are fighting with affordability issues. So upzoning, when you say, okay, you have a restricted supply, and the restricted supply is one of the main reasons that you don't have, that the prices are increasing, the natural policy is just, okay, let's upzone. Let's make this supply less restrictive. So there is a paper by Anna Gollet and co-authors for São Paulo in South America. There's a paper from Greenaway McGray and co-authors for New Zealand, Auckland, where they look at that, and also Asquith et al. Looking at 11 different cities in the US. What makes our paper a bit different is that we have very, very rich data at the very localized level. So we can see each building, how it changed over time. We can see for each plot of land how zoning changed over time. And the beauty of it is we have the data for over 25 years. Because we will also talk in the paper, you can see this is very important because for the upzoning to have an effect, it takes a long time. So those papers, they might find that it decreases rent, that it increases supply, but this is just probably a low level what they find. Probably the long-lasting effect is much bigger. As we see even in our study for 25 years, we're probably not capturing the whole effect. So I think this is one key thing in our study. The second is we can go very, very, very local. And a lot of people are getting worried about upzoning. Does it lead to gentrification? Does it increase amenities? Will it increase rents for everyone? All these questions that we can answer with this study.
Yeah, I think the local focus is a really important one, and work like the Asquith, Maston Reed on neighborhood effects of new housing on rents is really important. But as you say, your data is very rich, and you're really able to look at the building level over time and breaking up this whole region into these 100 by 100 meter, what you call rasters.
Maybe just to add to this, what Simon just said, I think another strength of the paper and the data that we have is that we can also look at heterogeneity in upzoning. So we can look at how does the effect of upzoning differ depending on whether we upzone a lot or a little, depending on whether we upzone in areas with high rents or low rents. And I think that this is very instructive and interesting for policymakers when thinking about how to design upzoning policies. And also, for example, when thinking about how to design inclusionary zoning, how much density bonus would we have to give to people so that the response in upzoning is still strong? So these kinds of questions.
Yeah. I think there's one or two studies of or reviews of multiple studies of upzoning in the US, and they'll combine like an ADU reform with a much more aggressive reform in another city and just kind of pool them all together and say, what is the effect of upzoning? And that is a contribution, but it's kind of, you can have the really weak upzones washing out the effects of the much stronger ones. And so being able to see within one kind of larger area, what is the differential effect of these is important. So we're already kind of getting into the study design, but I want to start off with a little bit of background on the canton of Zurich and how upzoning works there. So I'm just going to ask 3 questions in series, and you can just kind of get through all of them. The first, what is a canton? Second, what distinguishes the canton of Zurich from the other 25 cantons in Switzerland? And third, why do the municipalities in the canton need to change their zoning? What's motivating them or requiring them to do so?
Yes, so a canton is just a Swiss word for a state. So just like the US, Switzerland is quite a federally decentralized country with a strong role and fiscal autonomy of states and municipalities. And yeah, a canton is a state. And so we're basically looking at the state of Zurich, which is itself divided into 12 districts and 168 different municipalities.
This is a lot of jurisdictions for a country with 9 million people or so?
No, it's a very local thing. It's a very local, that's really true. Then I think, you can kind of think of it maybe a little bit in terms of like the greater Boston area, for example, which I think is of maybe a similar size in terms of municipalities, I thought. And how does the canton of Zurich differ from other cantons? Here, I think the main difference is that the canton of Zurich is the largest in terms of population and also the most urban one. And then when we think about why now do municipalities in the canton of Zurich need to change their zoning, then we basically have to go back a bit in history and start, I think, maybe like in the mid-90s, where you have to think that Switzerland overall is a country also with many rural areas, with a lot of farmlands, a lot of mountains, the Alps. And what happened in Switzerland is that there was really a strong problem of urban sprawl. So, for example, in the more rural areas, people were constructing a lot of land quite far away from the existing settlement areas. And this then started to raise concerns on the national and local level politically to say, okay, this is not very ecological. For ecological reasons, we need to change the way that we do our zoning and where we construct new housing. And therefore, Switzerland then started to pass reforms that urged municipalities to densify already existing settlement areas rather than constructing on the green field and combating urban sprawl.
Seems like a good idea.
Seems like a good idea. Yes, and it really came, I think, originally primarily for almost ecological concerns to protect the alpine landscapes, to protect cultural land for farming. So I think this was the logic where this push came from. And then over time, we started to have regulation at the national level that imposes basically on cantons and also on municipalities to densify existing settlement areas when they want to create more housing.
Can I just ask, I mean, if it's worth talking about, if anecdotes will be sufficient, because it's not really part of your paper, but just about this process of telling the municipalities that they had to do some upzoning, like I imagine there were some challenges and pushback from different municipalities, and kind of how did the canton government enforce these rules?
I think this strongly depends on where in Switzerland you are. So I think, for example, in the more rural areas, where this legislation originally comes from, they, until today, are basically struggling to implement a little bit these regulations, or maybe shouldn't say struggling, but they're working on implementing these regulations because they often even have to zone back, like they have to zone land that they zoned for housing back to agricultural land, which of course is not very easy to explain to a landowner. And then in the urban areas, there may be some more incidents of NIMBYism where maybe people didn't want the upzoning, but it really, I think, depends a lot on the local situation.
If I can add here, how they did a cantonal master plan, and deciding which municipalities are going to upzone and which not depends on the projection of population growth. So if you are a municipality that is growing, you should upzone more than a municipality that is losing population. Those are the municipalities that are making the opposite, taking land that was supposed to be built up and converting it back to agricultural land. So that was the first thing. And the other thing I want to highlight is that the canton of Zurich houses the city of Zurich, which is a global city, a city with a lot of housing affordability issues. And if you take the Superstar Cities paper by Joe Jork and co-authors, showing that superstar cities are cities that have a very inelastic housing supply and a very rapid demand growth, Zurich gets into this category. So I think this is important because this makes our results also applicable to other cities, superstar cities around the world, which are facing the same housing affordability issues.
Right. And so even within the Zurich metropolitan area, they use this process of giving bigger targets for growth to the municipalities that were already growing more. So it's kind of a pragmatic way to do it because these are the places that aren't restricting growth. So they're more likely to allow for more of it.
Also, one should say it's always a negotiation, right? There's not, how can I say this?
It's not like a formula.
Yeah, there's not like an exact formula, but
right.
The canton will believe, for example, the canton of Zurich is growing in population. They know that they are growing in population and that they expect to grow also in the future. So the cantonal government tries to come up with a kind of a long-term guiding plan of how we should be able to accommodate these additional people that come to Zurich because there's a lot of jobs and universities and everything. How can we accommodate them in the existing settlement areas? And then kind of in a back and forth process, one could say, comes up with how and where densification should occur.
Yeah, let's get into the upzoning process a little bit more and talk about what this looks like among the municipalities. Paavo and I actually talked about this a little bit with David Kaufman and Michael Vicky about this in episode 70. And it seems there's just a lot of direct democracy style voting in Swiss cities. But I want to get a bit more into the weeds of how this works and why it may be important and maybe even why this style of voting could be better for reforming zoning than having your representatives do it. Could you describe a little bit about how that works in Swiss cities?
Yeah, so I think this is a great moment to take like a little step back and explain a bit how the zoning system and approving new zoning plans works in Switzerland. So how doing a new zoning plan works is that usually first the urban planning department of a city will elaborate a new proposal for a new zoning plan. And then, as you correctly said, Shane, citizens need to agree with this new zoning plan. And if it's a bigger change in the zoning ordinance, then this requires a direct vote by the citizens. And here, it's really something very special about Switzerland that we are a direct democracy. So this means that when a new law or something like a new zoning reform needs to be passed, citizens need to vote on it directly. So you can imagine in practice that if a new zoning plan or zoning reform is passed, the government will send you a brochure to your home that explains you this new proposal for the plan, and then you can vote via post saying yes or no, so agreeing or disagreeing with the proposal. And the proposal will be accepted if at least 50% of voters accept the proposal. So this is how this would work. Then smaller changes, sometimes they can just be passed by the municipal parliament. So again, it depends a little bit on the municipality and so on. But overall, this is how it works to accept a new plan.
So I imagine a lot of times people reject the proposal. I mean, and then the city can come back with another proposal.
The city can come back with another proposal. Yeah.
I mean, are there any cases where they reject it 8 times and then get it approved? Or is it usually a couple times before people approve it?
I mean, usually it's not something like 8 times I haven't heard of, because usually you want to, maybe you come back once.
Right.
Or something like this. But not so many times, because usually you want to think that when there's the popular vote, you need to respect the popular vote, is what we would say.
Interesting. Okay.
I think my intuition is that direct democracy is going to make it harder to pass zoning reform. But at some level, it does sound like, if most of a city is not being upzoned at any given time, and even if you have kind of NIMBY people, as long as they're NIMBY, not in my backyard and not banana build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, then they might be happy to vote for a zoning plan that puts the additional capacity somewhere else, right? Even if they're not really excited about building more generally. Whereas I feel like actually when you have representatives doing this stuff, interest groups can carry a lot of weight. I'm sure also the fact that 70% of Zurich residents are renters helps a bit too.
Yes, I think when we want to think about how the political system in Switzerland with the direct democracy aids or prevents changes in zoning from being approved, I think there are various reasons why one could believe that, it may actually be, or this context in Switzerland may actually be helpful, even though this is beyond the scope of our paper. So yeah, that's more now something that we believe rather than something that we investigated in this paper. But I think something that is noteworthy about Switzerland is that new zoning plans, they need to be approved at the municipal level. And as you said, usually the zoning change will not be everywhere in the municipality at once. And I think there's also research, for instance, a recent paper by Evan Mast that shows that if you take those decisions on zoning on a higher geographical level, that then it is more easy to approve changes in zoning rather than taking them at like the ward or the neighborhood level. And I think this is very much the case in Switzerland.
Yeah, divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer. So this is one factor. A second factor, I think, as you already also mentioned, is the relatively low home ownership rate in Switzerland in international comparison. So in our study area in the canton of Zurich, around 70% of people are renters. And I think also in Switzerland, it's way more normal to rent across the income spectrum. Yeah, you could be very rich, you could still be renting. And I think this also helps potentially to, lower those interests in NIMBYism, keeping up home values. I think there are more people in Switzerland. Yeah, the median voter usually would be a renter. That's something that...
And I wonder, we're going off on this tangent probably too long, but I'm also thinking like the preserve the countryside argument for these upzonings seems like it would resonate strongly. I know some Swiss people, not very many, but I think, the connection to nature and, people have access to the countryside because there's a good public transportation. You can take the train to the Alps, right? And so, like that preservation motivation is probably there too.
No, that is definitely there too. And then I think a third factor that is also, I guess, a little bit important is that also for the context of the study, we need to think that it's not extreme upzonings that were done, right? It's not that we start at a single family zoned neighborhood and then all of a sudden we convert it into a very dense multifamily home area. But usually, I think just for historical reasons, many areas in Swiss cities and also in Zurich, they are just multifamily already. They're already relatively dense. And I think acceptance of densification is also just higher in these areas that aren't multifamily to begin with. So I think that's also something that makes people more prone to accept zoning changes in the context of the study.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I think that's probably enough context for the study design to make sense now. So let's talk about how this was all put together. Tell us how you set things up so you could estimate the effects of upzoning, making use of different timing of these zoning plan updates, these 100 by 100 meter rasters, and some very high quality zoning and building data. So what does that all look like?
Yes. So the key challenge in this project really was to overcome potential endogeneity of upzoning. And what I mean by this is that, of course, the location of upzoning, so the choice which parcels are being upzoned or not, is not random, but there's a reason why the urban planning department will choose a certain parcel to be upzoned, another one will not be upzoned. And therefore, this means that we could not, in our study, compare areas that were upzoned to areas that were not upzoned because they are fundamentally different. And there's a reason why one area was upzoned and the other area was not upzoned. And then the particular setting of the zoning reforms in the canton of Zurich, however, gave us an opportunity to kind of overcome this usual limitation of studying the effects of upzoning. Namely, what happens in the canton of Zurich is that you have these 168 different municipalities that all kind of follow the same logic in choosing which areas in their municipalities to upzone and which ones not to upzone. And then they change their zoning plans in different years. So, for example, you could imagine one municipality will change the zoning plan in 2005 and another one in 2010. Both times following the same logic when choosing certain parcels for upzoning.
And that logic is essentially dictated by federal policy, by the cantonal master plan, things like that?
By the cantonal master plan, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
Yeah, so the logic on choosing which parcels to upzone, that is kind of guided by the cantonal master plan that encourages, for example, upzonings that are close to nodes of public transit because they want to promote the usage of public transit and using less the car. We did a little analysis to see which factors predict upzoning in our sample, and we found exactly being close to the train station predicts it. Also being in an area that is already relatively dense also predicts it. So there are some kind of common factors that seem to guide the choices of policymakers when choosing which areas to upzone.
Mm-hmm.
And then back to this kind of the setting that we then use. So in the paper, we use what is called a staggered difference in difference model. And this means that we can compare parcels that are upzoned. All the parcels are upzoned, but some are upzoned earlier and some are upzoned later. And how the design works is that we compare parcels that are upzoned earlier, for example, a parcel that is upzoned in 2005, to a parcel that is upzoned later, for example, in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And this setting enables us to perform a difference in difference estimation to understand the effect of upzoning. Then regarding the data, we started by using historical zoning maps. We have historical zoning maps for the entire canton of Zurich over 25 years. Every year we see what was the current state of zoning on all parcels in all municipalities. And we can then use these maps to identify where upzoning took place and to identify where new housing was built. However, the polygons in the zoning plans, they change over time. And so to find a unit of analysis that was constant over time and also kind of more logical to interpret, we decided to use these 100 times 100 meter rasters. We also did a robustness check using some larger rasters, so you should not interpret too much into the size specifically of this 100 times 100 meter raster, but it was just something to help us to have a unit of analysis that is constant over time.
So it's just dividing the whole area up into these 100 by 100 meter squares.
That's exactly
Hundreds
it. Yeah.
or thousands of squares, each kind of like a mini neighborhood or something.
Exactly. I think you can almost think of it as like a very large parcel, like a couple of parcels grouped together. So it's still quite small, 100 times 100 meters. So we wanted to be sure that we can look quite locally at the effect of zoning. So that's why we chose like a relatively small size of the raster in our main analysis and then used a bigger one for robustness in the appendix. And next, we're also able to combine the zoning data with data on all buildings and with data on rent prices. So for the buildings, we use data that is from the Swiss Building Census and just has information on all the buildings, where they are, and how much units and square meters of housing space or living space they have. And then for rents, we use rent data that starts in 2005 and is again at the unit level, and it comes from when rental listings are posted online for a specific unit and then they're geocoded.
All right, so getting into the results, the direct effects of a successful upzoning should be more homes and more total floor area, and that is exactly what you found. Compared to the not non-upzoned, but later upzoned rasters, how much more living space and housing units were added in the upzoned rasters or the upzoned areas? Let's just start with the overall numbers, and we can get to the different results for smaller and larger upzones later.
Perfect. So yeah, the overall numbers, if you compare upzoned with not yet upzoned parcel, you get an increase of 9% in housing supply, meaning 9% in units, or also 9% in square meters. So the results are very similar. What does this mean, 9%? On a 100 by 100 raster, we have around 1,500 square meters of built living space. For the American audience, you can just multiply it by 10 and you get square feet, more or less. So 1,500 square feet, which is around 18 units. So a 9% is an additional 1.5 units, an additional 150 square meters of living space in those areas, just by being upzoned, a dummy. 0 if it's not upzoned, 1 if it's upzoned, not taking into how strong the upzoning was.
And just to be clear, we should interpret that as the amount of living space and housing units is growing around 9-10%, not it is growing 9 or 10% faster than the non-upzoned areas, correct?
Exactly.
So the coefficient is the estimated difference in housing. So it's not a growth rate, it's the housing stock, but there is over time 9% more housing stock compared to the not upzone or compared to our control group.
Yeah. And that's pretty significant.
Yeah.
Okay, so as I mentioned, the amount of residential square footage or square meterage and number of housing units increased more in places that were upzoned by a greater amount. The median upzoning was for 30.7% additional floor area. So half the rasters that experienced at least some upzoning were upzoned by more than that, and half were by less. Did you essentially just sum up the total square meters that were allowed if every parcel in that raster was developed to its maximum capacity before and after the zoning change, and then just divide that new higher zoning capacity by the previous lower capacity? So just for an example, if all the parcels together could be built to 100,000 square meters before the rezoning and then 150,000 square meters after that, that would be a 50% increase. Is it, as simple as that?
More or less, it's a bit more actually simpler. We're just looking at the floor to area ratio. Floor to area ratio, if you were allowed to build a FAR of 2 and you increase it to 3, that was an increase of 50%. In reality, this translates to exactly what you said, right? From 100,000 square foot to 150,000 square foot. So this is a reality, but the measure that we see is actually much cruder than that. We see the difference in zoning, and you have the different FARs, and we look at the FAR measure.
So you don't have data on what's already there in terms of what's built out?
We do see what's already there. We do see.
Oh, great.
We always observe what's already there.
Yeah, this is just for measuring how big the upzonings were to
right.
determine whether they're,
To clarify, yes, I think we follow exactly the approach, as you were saying, that we look at the maximum allowed FAR before the upzoning, and then we calculate the percent increase in the maximum allowed FAR after the zoning compared to before.
And within a raster, if you have multiple parcels, it's not necessarily the case that each of them is upzoned by the same percent. One might not be upzoned at all. One might be upzoned by 100%. And then you have to average that out based on the area within the raster and all that, I assume.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So it was a lot of work. Yeah, but we take those historic maps, overlay them with the raster, and then we find out, for example, if a raster is crossed by 2 polygons and one is 30% and one is 70%, then I make the weighted average of that.
Love me some proportional allocation.
Yeah. Okay, so to reiterate, a small upzone is any raster where the floor area increased more than 0 but less than 30.7%. And that's the allowable floor area, what the zoning allows. And a large upzone is one where floor area increased by more than 30.7%. Coming back to your measurement of living space and housing units, how did the changes compare in areas with small upzones versus large ones?
So we find that the effects are much larger for the large upzonings. And the 30%, just to put it in perspective, this is a building with 3 floors, and now you're allowed to build 4 floors, right? This is a 30% increase. So what we find is that the effect of upzoning on strong upzonings, on the ones that are above 30%, they go from 30% to up to 600%, are basically double the effect of the ones that are small upzonings below 30%. So we're talking from 6% versus 12%. So in the large upzonings, we get a 12% increase versus around the 6% increase in the small ones. So this is double the effect. It's much larger.
I can imagine that if you go, a 600% increase is much more likely to induce construction than a 100% increase, right?
Totally. So we did some heterogeneity. We have different ones in the robustness test. We did much stronger ones. The problem is we don't have a lot of 600 or 640, right?
So there's no control.
Most of them are concentrated around 30, 50. So we don't have a lot of those things. So we went much stronger, but then we started running out of observation, so we cannot do it. But we do have a robustness test where we go higher up. I think it was 80 or something.
Around 50%?
50, yeah.
50% it was, yes. And we see the effect gets stronger and stronger, which is what would you expect.
Right.
Mm-hmm. You also found that more housing units and living space was built in places with higher rents and with zoning that was more binding. Can you quickly explain what it means for zoning to be more or less binding as you measure it, and give us some sense for how big a difference these things make on your outcomes? Like, did rasters with higher rents or more binding zoning build a lot more, or maybe just a little bit more, but enough to be statistically distinct from other kinds of areas?
So there the effect is even larger. But let me first say what binding means. Binding means if you're in a raster allowed to build up to 3 floors, and you see that the average floors that were built are 3, this is binding. So they build already everything they're allowed to build. In some areas, they're allowed to build 2 floors and the average is 1.5. So it's not yet binding. They could actually add in some plots a floor here, a floor there. So this is what we saw as binding. And this is the measure that we observe. We observe how many floors are built. And it's a crude measure of bindingness, so we don't observe the actual FAR, but it's the best way we can do, and I think it's a good enough measure to see where it's binding or not. Now, the bindingness also correlates very strongly with high rent places, right? Because both are driven by demand.
Yeah, makes sense.
If demand is high, you're going to build up the maximum you can. And of course, if it's already binding, it means the supply is inelastic, the prices go up. So those are also the places with high rent. So the binding measure and the rent measure, the correlation is 74%. So 74% are the same rasters. One of our referees asked us to do the high rent and low rent measure because I think it's a much easier way for policymakers to see where should we upzone. Instead of looking how binding is the zoning in these places, let's just look at high rent, low rent, right? And I think that was a great measure. So it's basically measuring the same, but it's much easier to understand. So just to give you some numbers, how the effects differ, in the binding areas or in the high rent areas, we see upzonings, an effect on the housing supply of 30%, 30, versus around 2 to 3% in the non-binding.
Wow.
So it's even much more than strong upzonings to weak upzonings. With the rents, we have less observations. We don't observe the rents for the 25 years. So our observations are a bit lower. So we have very large confidence intervals, but still the differences are huge. But for rents, they're not statistically different because the confidence intervals are very large.
And I do want to highlight this or underline this because I feel like we keep seeing this in new studies that come out that, developers want to build where rents are high. But a lot of people think it's exactly the opposite. The developers specifically target low-income areas because that's where land is cheaper, for example. And that's not wrong. Land is cheaper there, but in a metro area, the cost of development in every other respect is pretty much the same, and only the land costs are higher in some areas. But the places with higher land costs also have considerably higher rents, and usually that makes the bigger difference. The reason we tend to see more development going into lower income areas here in US jurisdictions, and I think in many other places, is because that's in many cases the only place where it's legal to build more. And so, you were able to actually look at cases where they upzoned higher rent areas as well, which is great. All right, so that is the effect of upzoning on housing production. More living space and housing units in upzoned areas, and larger increases in areas with large upzones than smaller upzones, and more production in places where rents are higher and where zoning was previously more binding. That by itself is already good news, since Switzerland has these important goals for reducing sprawl and increasing transit use. So it is successfully using zoning changes to direct growth in ways that achieve that. But another major goal of upzoning is to improve affordability, certainly in the US, if not in Switzerland, or at least not when Switzerland started on this. And we expect places that build more housing to be more affordable than those that build less, all else equal. That's not quite what you found, or maybe not quite what you measured. So help us understand what you found when you measured the effect of upzoning on rents.
Yeah, so when we measured the effect of upzoning on rents, first the findings, so we found that upzoning does neither increase nor decrease rents. So upzoning happens, more housing is produced in these areas, but rents don't increase or decrease. Now, how can we make sense of this? So I think here it's very important to consider a couple of factors. So the first one is that we look at local rents, right? How can we imagine this? We look at an empirical strategy that compares parcels that were upzoned and where new housing is consequently being built, to similar areas where upzoning has not yet occurred and where therefore also not as much new housing construction is taking place. And then I think it's important to note in the Swiss context to make yourself kind of a mental image of, okay, what is going on? So these are areas that are upzoned, new housing is built, and this new housing in the context of Switzerland is often quite nice new housing. So when we set out to do the study, we were actually expecting that maybe upzoning would raise rents locally due to this new construction, because maybe this creates positive amenity effects in terms of nice new housing, maybe richer households move into these new buildings. So I think even though we don't find that upzoning decreases rents locally, for us, it was already like a surprisingly good news that upzoning did not increase the rents compared to these other areas.
Mm-hmm. Even from like a composition effect or something like that of just having nicer housing now, you might expect rents to be higher purely on that basis.
It's important to clarify. So the rent data is median list rent in a place, right? So it's not like a quality controlled rental index or something, or repeat rent index, or what is the rent data?
The rent data comes from online listings. So what we basically compare is rental units being posted online, which can either be in areas that are upzoned or in areas that are not yet upzoned, right? And it's going to be the rental price that someone is posting online when they are having an apartment that is free for rent. And then we do use both kind of this more crude measure that is nominal, but we also have one that is hedonic, so that controls for housing characteristics such as what is the building age and so on. So to take out this factor that new housing might just per se be more expensive. And so I think just to say a little bit more about our expectations, so we were not necessarily expecting that upzoning would bring down rent prices a lot in the areas where it occurs, but we were more expecting that it would trigger moving chains of some households moving maybe into these newly additionally built units due to upzoning, which may then kind of citywide dissipate and take a little bit the pressure out of the housing market.
Yeah, can you say a little more about that dissipation and maybe the role that market segmentation plays or doesn't play in all of this?
Yeah, sure. So there are new studies by Mast and Bratt showing these moving chains. Basically, the idea is that you build a new house, and since, as we heard, the upzoning was also in high-rent areas, high-income people move in, but they vacate their house where other people move in. And so if you don't have a segregation in the city, this moving chain filters down to the lowest income people. Now, if you are in a very segregated city, and for example, the Asquith paper, they look at low-income places and you build up, then the moving chain is very short because there's segregation. The people who move out there, there's no lower income to go, right? And in our case, the income was very high where people move in, so you have these long moving chains. So you see that kind of this dissipation of rent over the entire city. And this goes with a very simple monocentric city model, Alonso Move Mills model, where, people commute to the CBD. It doesn't matter the density you are. It just matters the distance from the CBD. So if you upzone half of the city on this side, you're going to have a price equalization of per square meter, per square foot. So this is the law of one price. So in our case, as Elena correctly mentioned, we look at the local rent effects. So to capture the overall rent effects, we would have to need a general equilibrium model. And even we thought about doing that, but even doing it for the canton of Zurich wouldn't be enough, because the commuting area, so the labor area, is just already bigger than the canton of Zurich. There are a lot of neighboring cantons where people live and they commute to Zurich, and you would have to take them into account too. So we're thinking of doing a project of taking whole of Switzerland and doing a general equilibrium model where we can actually measure the effect of rent. But unfortunately, some cantons are a bit delayed in digitizing the zoning data, so we don't have the zoning data for all the cantons yet.
Well, if you ever get it, you might be our first repeat guests if you ever publish that paper.
We're waiting. So they have to do it by law. They have to digitize it. So this is our hopefully follow-up project that we're thinking with Elena. So we cannot say something about the whole rent on the canton. But if you just take basic logic of supply and demand, if you assume that supply increased and that we show supply increased, then all else equal, this means rents in the canton of Zurich declined. Now, you also have to take into consideration the fact that I said Zurich is an open city. The canton of Zurich is an open place. So it also depends what the neighbor cantons did. But now, assuming that everybody in Switzerland upzone, these upzones did lower the rents. This is very hard to explain to policymakers because even though we've seen these upzonings and we've seen which basically helped increase the supply never matched the demand. The demand is increasing much more than supply. The supply is still very inelastic. And you can see that, okay, this is a step in the right direction, but it's still not enough. So people are just seeing prices increasing and they're saying, but this upzoning didn't help anything. Prices still did increase. And I think the New Zealand study by Greenway McRae is the same thing. Rents in Auckland still kept increasing. They just increased less than the other places that did not upzone. Right. And that's the same argument we want to make here, but we cannot because we don't have this general equilibrium model.
Yeah, so one thing I was wondering is, I guess Zurich has a lot of co-ops compared to other cities in Switzerland. So I wonder if, you looked at the differential tenure of the new construction, if it was not just like traditional rental Swiss style or co-ops, which may be a little different. I don't know if you could give your thoughts on that, how that might matter.
I mean, so that's a great point. So cooperatives in Switzerland, they have an important role in providing affordable housing. However, we consciously left these out of the study because, first of all, we couldn't get rental data on them, right? We kind of wanted to restrict ourselves to, first of all, the data that was there, which is more focused on market rate. And also then maybe if it's a very different logic of how you set your price because you're a cooperative, it's maybe not so comparable. So then in the end, we decided to just focus on everything that's market rent, which is still really the vast majority of housing.
Right. Can you give us a sense of the typical building that's built in these upzoned areas? It's 20 units, one owner that rents them all out, or how does it work?
So a typical building that would be built usually is one owner that rents all the units out.
Okay.
I think, it could be either private investors or institutional investors who pursue these kinds of projects. And then usually it depends a little bit whether someone was able to combine different plots into one bigger plot and really do like a very big project, which is something that is definitely happening, that someone is able to acquire like quite a large chunk of land with different houses, tear them down and really rebuild like a pretty big, maybe with like 100 plus units on it. Or it can be that there's really just one smaller house that is being torn down and replaced. And then it could also more be something like 15 units.
Okay, interesting.
To add to this, Bob, I think this is an interesting question because we see that there's heterogeneity in upzoning. And also for developing, this makes a lot of difference. So adding one floor to a building is easy to do. So also, development-wise, it's easy to do. Adding 2 floors, it's very hard. So you have to demolish the building and do a new one, right? And so we also see something that we haven't touched upon is like it takes time to see an effect. You don't see an effect in the first 4 years. You start seeing them 5 to 10 years afterwards. Right. And how you would imagine this thing is like you go to a neighborhood where you have single family houses and suddenly they come and say you can build up to 3 floors on that. But these families are happy living there, right? So they pass away at some point. The house is too expensive for the children. Nobody can buy the other one out. They sell it. A developer comes in, demolishes the house and builds up the 3 floors and maxes out the FAR. Another key finding that we have is that we only see development happening in 50% of the upzone parcels. So in the other 50%, nothing happens in these 15 years that we can observe. But on the 50% that something happens, in 84%, they max it out. So they built to the highest possible FAR that they're allowed to do. So the key thing is here, it takes a lot of time for this zoning to have an effect. And even in the 15 years that we were observing, we just observed 50% of the upzone parcels having an effect. So we think that also if you observe for 30, 40 years, this number is going to increase, right? So we haven't seen the whole effect. This is a slow moving effect and you should be aware of that. also because housing affordability is a pressing issue and policymakers want to solve it immediately.
Right.
And upzoning is a good form to solve it, but it's going to take time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think everything that we could do to address housing affordability takes a long time. I mean, California wants to build we're going to build a new social housing program, but that's not going to have an immediate effect either. Did you think about doing like a time elasticity with respect to the size of the upzoning? Because it'd be interesting to see, like, the bigger upzonings induce development quicker than the smaller upzonings.
Haven't done, but that's a good idea.
That's what I'd expect, yeah.
But we haven't. Is the temporal pattern? You should see it, right?
We should be able to observe that because we observe it over time.
Because we have it over time.
We know which ones developed. We know how much it changed. So we haven't seen that, but this is a very interesting point.
I mean, it depends on, like, for instance, if you compare areas where regulation is binding and areas where regulation is not binding, then for the one where regulation is binding, you kind of see an increase that gets a bit magnified over time, while for the areas where regulation is not binding, the pattern is different and basically nothing happens. But we didn't really calculate the measure you're suggesting. I mean, maybe one thing I could add just for kind of making sense of the effect we find on rents is that I just think this paper is also kind of interesting for a comparative perspective, because there are some other papers that, even though they don't look at upzoning, they just look directly at what happens when you construct new housing in a neighborhood to rent prices. Notably, for example, there's a paper by Lee and one by Asquith et al. That look at kind of this very specific setting of constructing a very big high-rise in a low-income neighborhood. And then they find that indeed rent prices decline in the areas around this new construction. So they do find this very localized decrease in rent. But I think it's interesting to just know or maybe understand this more also in future research, why we're not finding this so much. I think the main reason is that just for us, the increase is not so drastic in housing supply. And also it's not like a fundamental transformation of the neighborhood. Usually the sort of the facades, the feel of the neighborhood remains, in most cases, not in all, but in many cases it remains similar. And so that then it seems that if we upzone in those cases locally, we're not necessarily immediately going to feel a drop in rents.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the aggregate, you feel that across neighborhoods as the effect kind of spreads around through these moving chains.
Yeah.
Simon mentioned that only 50% of these upzoned rasters were redeveloped within 15 years, but I think that is a very high percentage actually compared to, how many parcels in general redevelop every 15 years. And I think it's just a sign of how binding, how restrictive zoning probably still is, even post-upzoning in Switzerland, just to kind of underline that point that the upzonings that have taken place, while helpful and while it's great that they've created housing where you want it and has not increased rents in the upzoned locations, it's probably still far short of what was necessary to really keep rents affordable. We're running out of time here, so I just want to ask our very last question to pull this all together. What would you say are some of the big lessons from Zurich for policymakers and advocates in other places? What does this tell us about what upzoning can accomplish, what its limitations are, and how zoning reforms can or should be tailored to have the greatest impact?
Yeah, I think our biggest takeaway, in my opinion, was just this very clear effect, no matter what we did, basically, in the regressions, is that it was very, very clear that upzoning increases housing supply in a manner that is statistically significant and also just economically meaningful when we look at the numbers of new housing units that were created because of the upzoning. That definitely is a meaningful impact. And then I think another lesson to take away would be how to design upzoning programs in a way that makes sense. For example, I know that in some areas changes are being made, but the changes are quite small. Maybe you're just taking away parking requirements, but that's all you're doing. And I think there our study would clearly say that this is not the kind of change in zoning that would induce a meaningful impact if you're seeking to create more housing. And then also that it matters which areas we target. So exactly that, maybe using a very high rent, like an above median rent, as a guiding factor on where to target for upzoning, that this could be a good idea.
Yeah, I echo that. So if you want to upzone places where zoning is binding or have high demand, where rents are high, do large upzonings. We don't observe that large of zoning. Switzerland is a country of consensus building, so you want to also have you want to avoid the NIMBYism, no? So you have to find the right balance there.
That is a little bit in conflict with the upzoning higher rent neighborhoods. But yeah, it's clearly the right thing to do, both from a moral standpoint and just a technocratic impact perspective.
Exactly. And the other thing you should be aware is it will take time. It will take time until you see the effects.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for the limitations, I think something that we haven't touched upon, but that I think is important maybe to note in the Swiss context is that since we are a place with so many rental households and upzoning sparks a lot of, tearing down older buildings and reconstructing newer ones, I think that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done on the side of policymakers in general to understand how can we do upzoning and promote this new housing construction and at the same time minimize potential problems that occur to those people that were living in these houses that are being torn down. There we have more research showing that these are often very low-income households who may have some troubles finding a new house in the current situation of the Zurich housing market. So I think bringing under one, I don't know how to say it, but like combining
under one
those
roof appropriately.
Under one roof, under one roof. We say under one hat in German, but I was like, that's all right. But yeah, so there is definitely, I think, work that needs to be done to understand how we can bring under one roof concerns about wanting to build more, about housing affordability that should be created by just building more, and at the same time understanding how this can be done in a socially encompassing manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a great point to end on. So Simon Büchler and Elena Lutz, thank you so much for joining us on the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You can read more about Simon and Elena's work on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on the socials. I'm on Blue Sky at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is on Twitter at El Pavo. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.